Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville, your host. Tonight is January the 12th, 2015, the second broadcast now of 2015. We're going to talk about a number of different topics, but of course, we've got to talk about the Charlie Hebdo massacre, terrorist attack that took place in Paris, France over the past week. We've got to look at that closely just for the sake of research and the sake of perspective. Also, of course, want to mention Syria, and I want to mention a change that is being made by the BATFE, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Explosives, and how that's going to affect the private manufacture of firearms here in the United States. We're going to talk about a number of those different issues, but before I do, I want to remind you all that you can find my work at activistpost.com, theantimedia.org, naturalblaze.com, a number of other media outlets there in the alternative media. Of course, if you want to keep track of my work specifically, then I would encourage you to go to brandonturbeville.com, and that is the website where I repost all of my articles, all of the YouTube videos, all of the archives of this show, all of the radio interviews, all that stuff is there at brandonturbeville.com. Of course, there is an events page there as well. There is a contact info page, as well as links to the books and to the radio show. You can buy the books if you want there on the website. Also, Truth on the Tracks. You can catch this show every Monday night and Friday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time here on UCY.TV, and you can access the show's personal webpage at ucy.tv/TT for Truth on the Tracks. And on that page, you're going to find the archive versions of this show, the RSS feed, or the links to my more recent articles on the left-hand side of the page, and you'll also find the chat room if you're into that. So, we've got a lot of material to cover tonight, so we're going to jump right on in. And I want to start in Syria. And essentially, I get this article up at Activist Post and BrandonTurbeville.com entitled Middle East Officials Question Convenient Mistakes of U.S. Airdrops to Al-Qaeda. And essentially what this is revolving around are the convenient, the accidental airdrops of weapons and supplies by the United States and NATO into the hands of ISIS and Al-Qaeda fighters inside Syria and Iraq. And these accidental, and I put accidental in quotes, these accidental airdrops are seeming to draw more attention throughout not just the alternative media outlets, through outlets such as mine, but also in the national governmental section. The Middle Eastern governments, particularly, who are becoming more and more, maybe not necessarily alarmed, because I think they've had a good idea of what's been happening to begin with, particularly the Syrian government, but they're becoming more and more vocal about what is happening. So, we have a number of individuals who have come out and questioned these airdrops, the accidental nature of these airdrops, publicly, but one of the more recent ones, is a high-profile commander of Iran's Basij force. This is Brigadier General Mohammad Reza Nakhti. And the Basij forces are essentially, they're volunteer forces, and this is something that's common there. In an address to the group of Basij forces on January 5th, Nakhti says, this is a quote, "The U.S. directly supports the ISIL in Iraq, and the U.S. planes dropped the needed aid and weapons for ISIL in Iraq." And that's the direct quote. He also said that the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad is the command center for the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant and other Takfiri militants. So, the U.S. military is portraying these ISIS members who are receiving weapons that are dropped by the U.S. military as just absolutely accidental. Nakhti is saying the situation is quite the opposite, contradicting the propaganda coming out of the State Department and the U.S. military. Nakhti also said that the Iraqi forces have managed to retrieve aid that was intended for ISIS fighters, not the other way around. So according to Nakhti, it's not that ISIS is capturing aid meant for Iraq. he's saying that Iraq is capturing aid meant for ISIS. So Nakhti's not the only one, of course. We also had the Iraqi member of parliament, Majid al-Gharawi. He recently stated that all the information available to him, quote, pointed out that the U.S. planes are supplying ISIL organization not only in Saladin province, but also other provinces. So he said, quote, the United States is not serious in fighting against the ISIL organization because they have the technological power to determine the presence of ISIL gunmen and to destroy them in 1 month. And presumably they have not done so. In other words, they have the capabilities, they know where they're at, they know what they're doing, they have the capabilities to destroy ISIL, but they haven't. So Gharawi also went on to say the U.S. is trying to expand the time of the war against ISIL to get guarantees from the Iraqi government to have its bases in Mosul and Anbar province. So essentially, well, let's move on here. We've got a report coming from Fars news agency. This is the Iranian news agency. The Iraqi Parliamentary Security and Defense Commission revealed that a U.S. plane did indeed supply ISIS with arms and ammunition in Saladin province in Iraq, and that has received little to no coverage here in the West. Big surprise. In December 2014, we also had another Iraqi lawmaker, that was Nala al-Hababi, questioning the motives of the U.S. government and its allies and the commitment of the U.S. government and its allies in terms of its opposition to ISIS. And he claimed that the ISIS groups are actually receiving a large amount of aid dropped by unidentified aircraft. This is what Hababi says, is quoted by Fars News. He says, the international coalition is not serious about airstrikes on ISIL terrorists and is even seeking to take out the popular Basij forces from the battlefield against the Takfiris so that the problem with ISIL remains unresolved in the future. And again, as I said, the Basij forces means the volunteer forces. So, also says the ISIL terrorists are still receiving aid from unidentified fighter jets in Iraq and Syria. Unidentified fighter jets providing aid to ISIS. So Hababi also states that airstrikes launched by NATO are only launched in areas where Kurdish Peshmerga forces are fighting. The other strikes, Hababi says, that are launched in other areas are, quote, not so precise. Well, that goes to show. That goes to show what I've been saying all along, that the not so precise is a very polite way of saying they're actually hitting civilian infrastructure. That's what I've been reporting here for the last few months, since the bombing campaign began. So again, the suggestion is that the coalition really has a vested interest in supporting the Kurdish forces, while not a vested interest in supporting Syria's Assad or Iraqi nationalism, and presumably Iranian influence as well. So Hababi clearly is not far off from that. So let's look at this report coming from Fars News. Let's read this report briefly. It says, in late December, the U.S.-led coalition dropped aid to the Takfiri militants in the area north of Baghdad. Field sources in Iraq told Al-Manar that the international coalition airplanes dropped aid to the terrorist militants in Balad, an area which lies in Saladin province north of Baghdad. In October, a high-ranking Iranian commander also slammed the U.S. for providing aid supplies to ISIL, adding that the U.S. claims that the weapons were mistakenly airdropped to ISIL were untrue. The U.S. and the so-called anti-ISIL coalition claim they have launched a campaign against this terrorist and criminal group while supplying them with weapons, food, and medicine in Jalala region. That's a town in Diyala Governorate in Iraq. This explicitly displays the falsity of the coalition's and the U.S.'s claims, Deputy Chief of Staff of the Iranian Armed Forces, Brigadier General Masoud Jazayeri, said. The U.S. claimed that it had airdropped weapons and medical aid to Kurdish fighters confronting the ISIL in Kobani, near the Turkish border in northern Syria. The U.S. Defense Department said that it had airdropped 28 bundles of weapons and supplies, but one of them did not make it into the hands of the Kurdish fighters. Video footage later showed that some of the weapons that the U.S. airdropped were taken by the ISIL militants. So these questions regarding these convenient accidents are by no means unique to the Middle Eastern governments or the Middle Eastern press or the Iraqi press or the Iranian press, but these types of so-called mistakes happen on a pretty regular basis in areas where the U.S. is allegedly fighting ISIS. Right? In October 2014, we had coalition forces dropping a number of aid supplies and ammunition supplies allegedly intended for the Iraqi people and anti-ISIS forces on the grounds into territory controlled by ISIS. But the mistake was confirmed by Iraqi officials and parliamentarians first, before it was reported here to minimal fanfare in the West. So it seems that only in the West does the general public look upon these types of mistakes as anything but a sloppy excuse to rearm the terrorist mercenaries to continue this proxy war. So we have that. Now, on into the Syrian issue, I've got this report came out. New UN report highlights Israeli connection to Syrian death squads. This is pretty important up at Activist Post, BrandonTurbeville.com. And of course, we've known for some time, and if you're a regular listener to this show, you will know that I have pointed out the fact that ISIS and ISIL, the other related terrorist groups fighting in Syria today, are entirely controlled by the West, by NATO, the UK, France, the United States, and so forth. And you'll also know that I pointed out on a number of occasions that not only are Saudi Arabia and Qatar and other Gulf state Arab feudal monarchies involved, including Jordan, and of course Turkey is also involved in the arming of death squad fighters as well, but Israel has been clearly fingered in this involvement as well. So, a recent series of reports, which spanned from March 2013 to November 2014, were released by the United Nations observers in the Golan Heights and submitted to the United Nations Security Council. These apparently corroborate many of the connections that I reported on here months ago, months before these reports, these UN reports, came out. So, the reports claim that at least for the past 18 months, the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, have been in regular contact with what they deem Syrian rebels, but of course we know that Syrian rebels is just a polite polite term for death squads and killers and cannibals and so forth. But they also admit that much of this assistance is going to members of the Islamic State as well. So, according to Haaretz, that's the Israeli news agency, the UN reports detailed several instances where there were close ties between the Syrian death squads and the Israeli military. There's a number of instances here. We have, for instance, on September 15th, a person... I'm sorry, it didn't take place on September 15th, but the reports coming from the International Business Times point out that a person who was wounded on September 15th was actually taken by what they deem armed members of the opposition, in other words, death squads. They were taken by death squads across the ceasefire line, where he was transferred to a civilian ambulance and then escorted by an IDF vehicle. And then they have a situation on from November 9th to November 19th. The UNDOF observed at least 10 wounded people being transferred by death squads from the Bravo side of across the ceasefire line to the IDF. All right. We also have the details released by the Israeli Health Ministry. They say about 1,000 Syrians have been treated in 4 Israeli hospitals. And of course, the question is, who are the Syrians they're treating? Are these civilians? Well, of course not. These are death squads. So besides the civilians, many of these people, and I put civilians in quote because a lot of this is just absolutely, it's deceptive, right? But many of these individuals are members of the Free Syrian Army and, of course, ISIS because they're the same thing. Now, Israel initially claimed that it only treated civilians, but it was forced to walk back from those claims a great deal after the release of the UN report, because when Israel was asked by I-24 News whether or not Israel had treated members of ISIS or al-Nusra, an Israeli spokesman, this is what the spokesman said: in the past 2 years, the Israel Defense Forces have been engaged in humanitarian, life-saving aid to wounded Syrians, irrespective of their identity. Well, that's something. Well, it's deceptive, because in the past 2 years, Israeli Defense Forces have been engaged in certainly not humanitarian life-saving aid to anything in the general area. But irrespective of their identity, that's not true, because Israel is quite content to kill Syrians left, right, and center. But the identities of the people that Israel is treating in their hospitals are not Syrian civilians. They are death squad fighters. So we have the assistance provided to Israel by provided to the death squads by Israel. Of course, not merely medical treatment. We've also got Haaretz reporting that some of these observers remarked in the report that came out on June 10th that they identified IDF soldiers on the Israeli side handing over 2 boxes to armed Syrian opposition members on the Syrian side, but they don't know what was in the boxes. The last report distributed to Security Council members on December 1st described another meeting between IDF soldiers and Syrian opposition members. Again, Syrian opposition members means death squads, that 2 UN representatives witnessed on October 27th. That was about 3 kilometers east of Moshav Yonatan. These observers said they saw 2 IDF soldiers on the eastern side of the border fence. They saw them opening the gate and letting 2 people enter Israel. The report, of course, did not note that the 2 people exiting Syria, the 2 people entering Israel, were injured, and they didn't note why they entered Israel, so as to presume that they were not injured if the gates were open up and they were allowed in. So one event that was very interesting in terms of what's happening on the Syrian side of the border, we have, again, back to the UN report, some of these UN observers have stated that tents were set up about 300 meters from the Israeli position for about 70 families of Syrian deserters. The Syrian army had sent a letter of complaint to the UNDOF in September and claimed that this tent camp was actually a base for armed extremists crossing the border into Israel. That's exactly what it was. Now, keep in mind, this is not something the mainstream reports will focus on, but what Syria is pointing out is that Syria didn't even really focus on it either, but these tent camps are not just refugees. These are not people who are affected by fighting who have been forced to live in tents to survive. These are families of Syrian deserters, right? People who have deserted the Syrian government and gone to fight with the death squads. These are their families. So it's been well known for quite some time that Israel has been providing wounded death squads with medical treatment inside Israel so they can continue jihad against the secular government of Bashar al-Assad. We have a report according to Colin Lynch of The Cable, which is the news wing of the Council on Foreign Relations, Foreign Policy magazine. So this is what Mr. Colin Lynch says. He says, in the past 3 months, and of course the time that this was written, it was April, and probably the past 3 months that he's referring to is April to June 2014. But the past 3 months, battle-hardened Syrian rebels have transported scores of wounded Syrians across a ceasefire line that has separated Israel from Syria since 1974, according to a 15-page report by UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon on the work of the UN Disengagement Observer Force, that's the UNDOF. Once in Israel, they received medical treatment in a field clinic before being sent back to Syria, where presumably some will return to carry on the fight. UN Blue Helmets responsible for monitoring the decades-old ceasefire report observing armed opposition groups transferring 89 wounded persons from Syrian territory into Israel where they were received by members of the Israeli Defense Forces, according to the report. The IDF returned 21 Syrians to armed opposition members back in Syria, including the bodies of 2 who had died. So later in the article, we also had Lynch mentioning the fact that Israel had provided medical assistance to death squad fighters since at least as far back as February 2014. Now, realistically, that aid was being provided even further back. So Lynch writes that Israel provided the medical treatment for at least a year, even at the time of the writing of his article, which was, in 2013. So this would put it as far back as June 2013. So in February 2014, we had Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu actually visiting one of the medical facilities where the Syrian death squads were being treated, and he's posing for a photo op, which you can see the pictures of Netanyahu shaking the hands of the death squad fighter there in an Israeli hospital. So with the connections between Israel and Islamic terrorism, particularly the terrorists wreaking havoc across Syria, this is no revelation, really, but it bears discussing, right? Israel has been long connected to terrorism, not only across the Middle East and across the world, but even terrorism within its own borders. Israel actually was responsible for creating Hamas, so that's something to bear in mind when observing the situation as well. So back on to, still on the track of Syria, we've got to mention the John McCain situation. The complaints filed at UN against McCain. Senator meets with terrorists, fascists, and Nazis across the world. So we recently had John McCain's travel history back in the headlines, and this time his visit to Syria in 2013 that I covered and helped push up to the mainstream. I think I'd like to say that I had some small hand in that, with the New York Times trying to refute the claims that are easily provable by looking at the photographs. This trip is becoming pushed back into the forefront of the discussion and even at the mainstream. Syria has filed a complaint with the United Nations regarding McCain's illegal entry into Syria in order to meet the death squads and coordinate with the death squads and help the death squads in their goal of slaughtering hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians. And of course, we've also got French Foreign Minister Bernard Kouchner, former Kuwaiti politician Walid Tabai, and former U.S. diplomat Peter Galbraith were other officials named in the letter to the UN. But it was McCain's visit that's drawn much more attention, since it was revealed that McCain had not only met with the commander of the fundamentalist moderates, the moderate cannibals of the Free Syrian Army, but also with the actual cannibal Abu Sakar and the leader of ISIS himself, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. So we have this meeting that I've mentioned before, but we also had meetings in the past where McCain met with terrorists in Libya, which he called his heroes at one point, and went on to murder U.S. Ambassador Chris Stevens in Benghazi. And we've also got McCain meeting with fascists and Nazis inside Ukraine as the color revolution that was taking place over there was in full swing. So Syria's official letter to the United Nations didn't focus on the fact that he was meeting with terrorists, but they focused on the fact that it violated Syrian sovereignty. So the Syrian ambassador to the United Nations, Bashar Jafari, urged UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and UN Security Council to pressure national governments to quote, put in place the necessary measures against their nationals who enter Syrian territory illegally. He also went on to say that such actions are a blatant violation of Syria's sovereignty and of the resolutions of the Security Council concerning Syria. So McCain did respond to the letter, typical defiant fashion of McCain, the typical defiant fashion of somebody who knows damn well that he won't be treated equally among the law, that he knows that he's above the law and he's not subject to the law, the restraint of the law that average citizens would be subject to. This is what McCain has to say. It is a sad but unsurprising truth that the Assad regime is less concerned with its massacre of more than 200,000 men, women, and children than it is my visit with those brave Syrians fighting for their freedom and dignity. The fact that the international community has done virtually nothing to bring down this terrible regime, despite its atrocities, is a stain on our collective moral conscience. John McCain is a stain on our collective moral conscience. I'd just like to point that out. But he doesn't hide the fact that he entered Syria illegally. He doesn't deny that he met with terrorists. In fact, he openly admits that he met with these terrorists. He just denies his meeting with one specific terrorist, in other words, Baghdadi. But the alibi that McCain provides is that he met with another terrorist as a member of the Northern Storm Brigade. And the Northern Storm Brigade was responsible for kidnapping a number of people out of Lebanon. And they are as fundamentalist as the Free Syrian Army and ISIS as well. So whatever his statement is, whether it's true or not, and it's not, the fact is that he met with terrorists. So that should not be forgotten. So despite all the reports and the coverage of McCain's connections to these terrorists, the provision of material support to terrorism was only covered by mainstream media when Rand Paul accused McCain of unknowingly meeting with the Islamic State. So Rand Paul, all the libertarians, their favorite neocon, Rand Paul, accused John McCain of unknowingly meeting with the Islamic State. So once again, we have the coincidence theory arising yet again to protect the ruling class. So I don't think that Rand Paul would have given any other American citizen the benefit of the doubt that he gave to John McCain, and I don't think that any other American citizen would be exonerated from prosecution for meeting with the Islamic State like John McCain was. I would suspect that these individuals would be accused of knowing full well who they met with, but then some people are more equal than others in such utopias. Now, McCain's meeting with the terrorists in Syria did receive a spat of mainstream media coverage, as well as that tepid accusation coming from Rand Paul. New York Times had to get called, the famous organization to help promote the Iraq War, was called into action to debunk the evidence that McCain had met with terrorists and cannibals and ISIS fighters after the photographs began circulating. And let's go to the New York Times. Let's see how we're looking on time here. Okay, we got a few minutes here, but I got to get into the Charlie Hebdo thing. New York Times says, Senator John McCain was one of the earliest advocates of American military action against the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. Well, that's not really fair, because John McCain is one of the earliest advocates for every war that we've ever fought, or that we probably ever will fight. Name your war. John McCain was an early advocate of it. All right, so it has been vexing for Mr. McCain to be battling persistent and false internet rumors that he not only helped invent the group, but also knows its leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the self-proclaimed caliph of the Muslim world and America's latest public enemy number one. Well, thanks for putting that to rest, New York Times. The rumors are false. Well, thanks for the evidence that the rumors are false. They're not rumors. The photographs are there. You can see the rumors. And if McCain is being vexed by the rumors, the alleged rumors that he's supporting terrorism, then I have a suggestion for Mr. McCain. Step down. Retire. Get out of the limelight. If it bothers you so much, don't let the door hit you on the way out. We all hate you. We don't want you in the Senate anymore. Matter of fact, you can just get the hell out of the country, as far as we're concerned. So go back to the New York Times. The rumors are based partly on images of a Syrian fighter who resembles Mr. Baghdadi, seen in photographs with Mr. McCain, some originally posted on Twitter by the senator during his visit in May 2013 to northern Syria. He met with members of the Free Syrian Army, terrorists, an insurgent group that opposes ISIS, and that President Obama, in a speech Wednesday on his new strategy for battling ISIS, has vowed to strengthen. Nurtured by conspiracy blog post. You know you're onto something when you get called conspiracy blog post. Social media and photo altering tricks. The damn photos were posted on his Twitter by John McCain himself. Did he alter his own photo? The false rumors of Mr. McCain's relationship with ISIS have taken on a life of their own. His false rumors of Mr. McCain's relationship with ISIS. where's the evidence that they're false? They never provided any, right? So the New York Times admits that McCain met with the Free Syrian Army. That itself is a terrorist organization. I mean, imposition of Sharia law, indiscriminate killing, murders, rapes, cannibalism, all of that has come from the Free Syrian Army. And the New York Times would have done well to read its own article back in April 2013 by Ben Hubbard, where Ben Hubbard said that nowhere in rebel-controlled Syria is there a secular fighting force to speak of. Remember that. So the New York Times should at least be able to Google its own articles before it posts the tripe that it does. Of course, New York Times is nothing but a very thick fish wrapper. If you have a bunch of fish that you need to wrap, then I would recommend the New York Times because it's one of the thickest newspapers that's available. So the FSA commanders, I mean, I could go through this ad nauseum, right? We had Bassel Idris admitting to collaborating with ISIS and al-Nusra. Of course, FSA commander, Bassel Idris is an FSA commander, and showing that the moderate rebels aren't moderate at all. And in an interview with the Daily Star of Lebanon is where he said that. We also have Idris admitting that many of these FSA fighters have pledged allegiance to ISIS. We had Abu Fida, who's a Syrian army colonel, who's part of the Revolutionary Council. He's formerly a Syrian army colonel, who became part of the Revolutionary Council in the Kalamun, said the same thing, that ISIS and FSA worked together. We also had the Syrian Revolutionary Front admitting to working with Nusra and Al-Qaeda. Jamal Maroof admitted that. We also had the number, I mean, it's almost innumerable, the instances in which the FSA factions and individual fighters of the FSA allegedly defected to Jabhat al-Nusra or ISIS and took along the training and the weapons that they were given. We have Abu Athir, who is an ISIS commander, told Al Jazeera that his group bought weapons from the FSA. In fact, here, let me read the quote. Anyhow, we are buying weapons from the FSA. We bought 200 anti-aircraft missiles and concourse anti-tank weapons. We have a good relations with our brothers in the FSA. So we also have the family of Steven Sotloff, who's that American journalist who was allegedly beheaded by ISIS. They told CNN that the U.S.-backed FSA rebels had sold Sotloff to ISIS for $25,000 to $50,000. Of course, White House denied the claim, but the White House would deny any of these claims. Theo Padnos was a journalist who was held hostage in Syria. Well, he confirms that when he escaped a couple of times, and every time he escaped, he was returned to Jabhat al-Nusra by the FSA. They're the same groups. But we've also got Salim Idris. I don't think there's any relation to Bassel. But he was one of the men seen in the photographs with John McCain. He's one of the commanders of the FSA, the so-called moderates. And, of course, I just went through a list crimes of the FSA. We had murders, rapes, beheadings, all of that garbage took place under the FSA. And, of course, we also had the photograph with Abu Sakar, the heart-eating cannibal, is in the pictures with John McCain. So, and of course, I mentioned the obvious pictures of ISIS leader Abu Bakr Baghdadi in pictures with John McCain. So again, they offer the defense by saying that this is actually came by Brian Rogers, communications director for McCain's office, who said that the man in the picture was not Baghdadi, but it was a guy from the Northern Storm Brigade. As I mentioned earlier, the Northern Storm Brigade was famous for kidnapping a group of religious pilgrims crossing through Syria in September of 2012. So Gladstone, and this is the evidence, by the way, this is the sole amount of evidence coming from the New York Times, is that Brian Rogers, the communications director for McCain, comes out and says, no, the photos are false, it's actually some other terrorist. So we'll reject that. But the guy writing for New York Times, Gladstone, he might be surprised, since there are false rumors of John McCain's relationship to ISIS, that they were confirmed by John McCain. So he was on the Sean Hannity show after Rand Paul gave that tepid criticism, and this is what John McCain says. He says, has Rand Paul ever been to Syria? Has he ever met with ISIS? Has he ever met with any of these people? No. We're going to have a fight because it's patently false. This is the same Rand Paul that said we didn't want to have anything to do with anything, by the way. I don't want to get in a fight with him at all, but it's not true. I know these people. I'm in contact with them all the time, and he is not. Well, if you're in contact with ISIS all the time, your ass needs to be in prison. Period. He admitted it on the Sean Hannity show. But of course the New York Times and all its wisdom, the same wisdom that got us helped get us into Iraq, and the same wisdom to help cover up the not hacking scandals, but surveillance scandals, is now telling you, oh, it's not true. He doesn't have connections to death squads, no matter how many times he admits it. He says, he was criticizing Obama. He said he could personally show Obama places on the map to bomb in Syria. He says, I know these people intimately. We talk to them all the time. Well, isn't that interesting? I wonder what would happen to any other American citizen that talks to ISIS all the time. So we have, again, just wanted to point out a little more of McCain's treachery, right? Because in April of, I believe, 2012, or maybe it was actually earlier. The year, I'm not so good with dates sometimes. 2012 was this? Maybe this was 2011 actually. I can give you the date if I look close enough, but I think it's it's 2011, April of 2011, when he visited Benghazi, which is the area where U.S. Ambassador Chris Stevens was killed. And despite the overwhelming evidence that was available at the time, and even admissions from Abdul Belhaj, one of the leaders of the Libyan death squads, McCain would say, I have met these brave fighters and they are not Al-Qaeda. To the contrary, they are Libyan patriots who want to liberate their nation. And those Libyan patriots killed Ambassador Chris Stevens, and those Libyan patriots were documented as being members of Al-Qaeda. And those Libyan patriots went on television interviews and gave interviews to newspapers and screamed at the top of their lungs that they were Al-Qaeda. And those Libyan patriots then flew the Al-Qaeda flag above the capital in Tripoli when they took over. But I guess McCain would prefer to ignore that small part of it. So those Libyan patriots also waged war against the black people in Libya and slaughtered them left and right by large numbers. So John McCain can be directly held responsible for that. Remember, around the same time that Victoria Nuland was running around and saying fuck the EU and declaring that the United States had allocated $5 billion to bring about democracy in Ukraine, install a Western puppet there in Ukraine. Conveniently, the very individual that they picked to become the leader became the leader. John McCain had traveled to Ukraine to meet with the Svoboda Party and the Euromaidan protest participants. The Svoboda Party, by the way, is a neo-Nazi party. And so I guess songbird John McCain can add that to his repertoire as well. So, again, as I said, some people are more equal than others in these utopias. John McCain will not be in prison, will not be tortured again, allegedly again, as he's a war hero, I suppose, a false war hero. This was one of the guys who helped scuttle the congressional inquiry into the existence of American prisoners of war in Vietnam, and then has the nerve to come back and throw his military service, if you're so proud of that, to throw that into everybody's face. So this is John McCain. I don't know what else I can say about that. We're running out of time. I need to get to the Charlie Hebdo massacre. But I will point out the tragedy and the lack of justice in the world, because in Vietnam, tens of thousands of brave young American men were killed in Vietnam. Yet John Kerry and John McCain survive. If that's not evidence for the fact that there's no justice in the world, I don't know what you can what you can say. I mean, God, we'll trade. We'll take 2 for 1. Give us one of the other Vietnam veterans, and we'll give you 2 of these. All right, enough of that. Let's go to the Charlie Hebdo massacre, because this is the news everywhere, at least for this week. The American attention span will shift shortly. Nobody will care, but we've got to get onto this. Now, I wrote an article, 6 points to consider when analyzing the Charlie Hebdo attacks. And this, of course, I'll go ahead and put it out there. I am in the camp that believes firmly that this was a false flag attack. Now, we can't go out and every time there is a violent attack, going out and claiming that it's a false flag. We got to guard against knee-jerk reactions. Not everything's a false flag. At the same time, when you engage in any kind of analysis, whether it's historical analysis, whether it's an analysis of current events, you cannot ignore conspiracies and false flags where they exist. So in other words, your job is not to find conspiracies, but it's certainly not to ignore them. And here I think we have the evidence of a conspiracy. So we've got this attack. We've got the Charlie Hebdo magazine, which is known for posting obscene, offensive cartoons of religion, well, against 2 religions, Christianity and Islam. Judaism is immune to criticism, apparently. And the magazine's well known for doing this, right? It's done that. They've been firebombed in the past, and I don't know about that specific instance, but it's thrown the Muslim world into a tizzy. It's thrown the Christians into a tizzy, and all of that stuff. So we've got the pro-war right that is xenophobic. They're simply attacking all Muslims as extremists and saying only they're a total annihilation and the implementation of an even greater police state are the only solution. Then on the other side, you've got the pathetic left wing who is attempting to blame the victim for incitement and focusing on the need to become politically correct and self-censoring and linguistic minimalism and all that kind of crap. And then you've got the vast majority of people in the middle who just believe whatever they're told on television. They quake in their boots and then they move on to the next form of entertainment provided to them by the culture creators, and they just don't think a thing about it afterwards. So we're going to have to think some things about it. And I want to point out that we've got 6 points in this article, and we're going to try to get to some others. Point number 1, reports suggest the attackers acted as if they had military training. Reports are confirmed that the alleged assailants did receive military training in Syria. So we've got an article by David Blair for The Telegraph. This describes the actions of the killers in Paris. He says, they were also fully equipped for their murderous task. Photographs taken at the scene show 2 men clad entirely in black, their faces concealed by balaclavas. Each one is armed with an AK-47 assault rifle. They wear army-style boots and have a military appearance and manner. One of the men wears a sand-color ammunition vest, apparently stuffed with spare magazines. Some reports suggest that the attacker was also carrying a rocket-propelled grenade launcher. The men attacked the magazine's headquarters with clinical precision, killing their victims and then shooting 2 police officers in the street outside, who were Muslim, by the way. Amateur footage shows them using classic infantry tactics. They move along the street outside the office working as a pair. One advances while the other gives cover. Instead of spraying automatic gunfire, they fire 2 aimed shots at each target, a pattern known as double-tap firing, thereby conserving their ammunition. So again, Army-style boots, military appearance, and manner. Military appearance and manner. Classic infantry tactics. So we also had Stratfor. Stratfor gave its appraisal of the situation, and it says, from the way they handled their weapons, moved and shot, these attackers conducted a successful attack using what they knew, instead of attempting to conduct an attack beyond their capability, failing as a result. So truth is that these attackers did receive military training if, the individuals that were convicted or have been blamed for this were indeed the ones in the masks. They were fighters in Syria at one time as part of the U.S.-backed jihadi army, the proxy army, fighting against Assad, the secular government of Assad. So the mainstream reports stated that the attackers spoke flawless, unaccented French, despite the fact that they were members of foreign Al-Qaeda and Yemen organization. We also had a CBS News report, says Corinne Ray, the cartoonist who said she was forced to let the gunmen in, said the men spoke fluent French and claimed to be from Al-Qaeda. And in an interview with the newspaper La Humanité, she says the entire shooting lasted perhaps 5 minutes. Okay, so we have 3 guys. One of them, Sharif Kouachi. He was one of the suspected attackers. No stranger to French law enforcement, right? He was sentenced to 3 years in prison with 18 months suspended for terrorism charges in 2008 when he was convicted of criminal association with a terrorist enterprise. Now, the group which Sharif Kouachi was affiliated with was known as the 19th Arrondissement Network, named for the neighborhood it was based out of. So the Arrondissement Network, named out of that neighborhood. It was involved in recruiting French Muslims to fight for Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And it's pretty typical, all right, of these Western-backed terrorist operations. The group preyed on poor people, on disenchanted people, struggling people, working-class young men. They would procure the necessary manpower. The group would then organize for weapons training and provide the travel arrangements to go take these individuals to the Middle East. So he was convicted in 2008. He was arrested in 2005, just days before he planned to travel to Syria. That was the first time. Sharif fits the profile of a target for terrorist recruits. Right? He was Muslim. He'd left school. He was working a dead-end job. He was lower working class. So the narrative being constructed, or that was constructed, is that this gullible young man then fell under the spell of this charismatic street preacher that they called Farid Benyato, who just trolled the east side of Paris. It's implied that Benyato, who was also convicted on terrorism charges, played a role in setting up Sharif with the terrorist organization he eventually joined, and his subsequent travels to Syria to slaughter innocent people for the U.S.'s geopolitical goals. But we got a note that out of the individuals who were in this group, right, Benyato was responsible only for recruitment. Right? He was never going to go to Iraq. So we also have affiliations with the 19th Arrondissement Network, with the Adawa Mosque, one of the largest mosques in Paris, and we hope that somebody will look deeper into that soon as well. So all of the suspects were on the terrorist watch list of authorities long before their attack in Paris. Also, that's important to point out. We'll go into some of this deeper if we have time in the show. Number 2, the publication that was attacked has served to promote the strategy of tension in the past. Okay, now we had Charlie Hebdo. We don't know for sure about this organization, right? It could be a media outlet who just reveled in the irreverence of Islam and Christianity, or if it was something more sinister, some type of front organization, some type of tool in the strategy of tension. The magazine was certainly no stranger to controversy, right? We had caricatures of Prophet Muhammad and other sketches of Islam. Offices were firebombed in 2011 after it had a caricature of Muhammad on the cover. The publication did that again, and it caused a bunch of ire to be drawn from the Muslim world. And another cartoon in last week's issue actually was entitled "Still No Attacks in France," and had a caricature of a jihadi fighter saying, "Just wait, we have until the end of January to present our New Year's wishes." And the guy who was the artist, Charb is what they call him, who was the artist, he was one of the ones who were killed. So the magazine had offended other religions and belief systems. It was allowed to operate despite the violent reactions that its statements and cartoons had produced across the world, but not when they criticized Judaism, and that's interesting, right? In 2009, an 80-year-old columnist for the magazine was put on trial on charges inciting racial hatred simply because he made a joke that the President Sarkozy's son was converting to Judaism for financial gain. And he was fired from Charlie Hebdo. I mean, he made that joke and was put on trial and fired. But this is a country where if you deny the Holocaust, you could actually go to jail. So, I mean, but you can make pictures of the Pope having sex with a goat, or the Muhammad having sex with a rabbit, or the two having sex with each other. Whatever you could do that, till the cows come home. So, France has allowed the magazine to continue lampooning Islam and Christianity, which are apparently still acceptable targets of derision. Of course, those two would be acceptable targets of derision because they're going the way of the dinosaur. Religious organizations, Muslims, Christians, of course, responded with the typical response of fundamentalists all over the world by attempting to stop freedom of speech and expression for those people who might not exactly be converted by the arguments of the people who are. They used the government apparatus, of course. The Catholic organizations tried to sue. The Muslims rioted. All that crap. Most Christians and Muslims, of course, probably hated the magazine, but they went about protesting in ways that most Americans would do as well. They bitched to their friends and families, and then turned on the football game and moved on. A very small amount of people are moved to action, and even smaller amount of them are moved to violence. But the latter, the smaller minority that is moved to violence, is generally done so by foundations and NGOs or intelligence agency-affiliated religious organizations. So, except for its treatment of Judaism, where France protects virtually any criticism, even smart aleck remarks, it's sided with freedom of speech when it comes to attacking Christianity and Islam. So, that being said, Charlie Hebdo has acted as a catalyst in a number of different incidents, as a catalyst for incitement. Now, I'm not blaming the magazine for the reaction of the of medieval people, right? Of unprogressive people. But what I'm saying is that the magazine has repeatedly put these things out that has disturbed communities in France and across the world. And I want to ask publicly, is it possible that Charlie Hebdo actually served the purpose of intentionally inciting these types of religious riots and acts of violence from fundamentalists brought into France by the French government and armed by the French government in other countries? Is Charlie Hebdo really a free and independent magazine, or is it actually a tool of the Anglo-Americans in an attempt to maintain the strategy of tension domestically and abroad? So number 3, France arms terrorist groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda. If the attackers were indeed members of one of these terrorist groups, and there's a myriad of terrorist groups that are documented to be under the direction and control of Western powers, by the way, France itself is to be implicated in the cause and execution of the attacks. As part of the NATO coalition, France has been arming, funding, aiding, perpetuating Al-Qaeda terrorists for years, right? This is on record in Libya, where France helped lead the charge to overthrow Gaddafi. And it continues today with the backing of Al-Qaeda and ISIS and the Free Syrian Army is all the same thing in Syria. So, the attacks in Paris were essentially the work of the terrorists that the French have been arming and backing in North Africa and the Middle East. The French government itself is responsible for this, and hopefully we'll get into this. Now, let me just point out some things. This is coming from Tony Cartalucci, right? In his article, Timeline, Where'd Parachuters Get Their Weapons? Go check that article out, but I won't go through all this. It says, 2011, France supplying weapons to Libyan rebels, London Telegraph. A French military spokesman, Colonel Thierry Boucard, said it has provided light arms such as assault rifles for civilian communities to protect themselves against Colonel Gaddafi. but the decision to arm the rebels is a further move toward direct involvement in the land war on top of the air war against Colonel Muammar Gaddafi. The Nafouza rebels have come closest to breaking through to Tripoli itself of any of the front lines of the conflict, while 3 months of NATO bombing have failed to dislodge Colonel Gaddafi from power. Le Figaro, the French newspaper which first reported the airdrops, said the shipment included rifles, machine guns, and rocket-propelled grenades, along with Milan anti-tank missiles. 2011 again. Libyan rebel commander admits his fighters have al-Qaeda links. London Telegraph. Abdel Hakim al-Hasidi, the Libyan rebel leader, has said jihadists who fought against Allied troops in Iraq are on the front lines of the battle against Muammar Gaddafi's regime. 2012, France to push for arming Syria's opposition coalition, the BBC. France's foreign minister has said he will discuss supplying arms to the Syrian opposition coalition with European partners. The government plans to push for a relaxation of the EU arms embargo to Syria to enable defensive arms to reach opposition fighters. 2013. Syria crisis. France and Britain move a step closer to arming rebels. The London Guardian. France and Britain have moved a step closer to arming the opposition to Assad regime in a radical move aimed at tipping the balance in the 2-year civil war while also ignoring European policy on Syria. The French President François Hollande went into an EU summit in Brussels with a dramatic appeal for Europe to join Paris and London in lifting a European arms embargo, but the sudden policy shift was certain to run into stiff German opposition. 2013, Syrian rebels pledge loyalty to al-Qaeda, USA Today. Syrian rebel group's April pledge of allegiance to al-Qaeda's replacement for Osama bin Laden suggests that the terrorist group's influence is not waning and that it may take a greater role in the Western-backed fight to topple Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. The Pledge of Allegiance by Syrian Jabhat al-Nusra Front Chief Abu Muhammad al-Julani to al-Qaeda leader Sheikh Ayman al-Zawahiri was coupled with an announcement by the al-Qaeda affiliate in Iraq, the Islamic State of Iraq, that it would work with al-Nusra as well. 2014, France delivered arms to Syrian rebels. Hollande confirms. France 24. President François Hollande said that on Thursday that France had delivered weapons to rebels battling the Syrian regime of Bashar al-Assad a few months ago. So, those are just a few articles. Number 4. France ordered aircraft to the Gulf in order to fight ISIS nearly a full day before the attacks in France. Now, this itself is not conclusive evidence that the attacks were an inside job, but you got to remember, right at the time that the French were considering, or the French parliamentarians and the French people were hesitant to engage in military action in Iraq, ISIS released that video of the Frenchman who was being beheaded, and that provided the justification for greater French involvement. That was the third video in a series of videos that provided justification for action in each of these target countries. Right? It was the United States, Britain, and France, back to back. So we have the fact that the French military announced a full day before the attacks against Charlie Hebdo took place that the Marine Battle Group will be deployed to the Gulf. Let's see what we have here. It says January 6th. This came from Agence France Presse. It says the deployment of the Marine Battle Group is due to be announced by President François Hollande when he gives his annual New Year's speech to the armed forces on board the Charles de Gaulle on January 14th, according to the Mer et Marine news site. The LSE Palace confirmed to AFP that the carrier would travel to the Gulf on its way to India, where it is due to take part in exercises in mid-April. The Charles de Gaulle will be available to participate, if necessary, in all operational missions, the LSE spokesman said. According to Mer et Marine, the Charles de Gaulle carrier will travel to the Gulf with its fleet of air and naval craft, including Rafale and Superintendard fighter jets and an attack submarine, to take part in the U.S.-led bombing campaign against ISIS forces in Iraq. So, we are out of time, ladies and gentlemen. I apologize. Please, we'll continue the discussion of Charlie Hebdo attacks and the nature of the attacks next week. Stay with us. This has been Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville. We'll see you next week.